Marx killed science with logic. Okay, hey nerds, I'm going to continue my series today on Derrida's book, Specters of Marx. And of course, Derrida is a 70s post-structuralist philosopher who focused more on language than my boy Foucault, who's famous 70s pervert post-structuralist philosopher. And he focused more on history, while Derrida focused more on language. And they both were post-structuralists because they rhetorically and in writing deconstructed institutions of the modern era, such as religion, science, and government. So, this is Derrida's book, obviously on Marx, and contrary to what people like Jordan Peterson say, post structuralists, slash, as he calls them, postmodernists like Foucault and Derrida were not actually Marxists. In fact, they were highly critical of Marx in many ways. They had influence on him, and they wrote and or he had influence on them, and they wrote about him. But writing about Marx does not actually make you a Marxist, which is connected to the stupid reason I mentioned before, that people like Jordan Peterson and James Lindsay, of course, famous former clinical psychologist and pseudo intellectual crackpot Jordan Peterson, and slightly smarter pseudo intellectual crackpot James Lindsay, falsely claim the so-called cultural Marxists or critical theorists in the Frankfurt School are Marxists, even though they merely actually wrote about Marx. So they have this false notion that writing about Marx makes you a Marxist. But again, Derrida was not a Marxist. In fact, he was highly critical of Marx. However, he was influenced by Blanchot, who was a 20th century philosopher and writer who wrote about subjects like death and poetry. And like I said, Blanchot had a heavy influence on post structuralist philosophers like Foucault and Derrida. So, in this section of Specters of Marx, this is more like philosophy inception. I'm commenting on Derrida quoting Blanchot's opinion of Marx. And you can tell by this quote that Blanchot was a lot more favorable to Marx, but his perspective is interesting too. So let's get into it here. So this is Derrida quoting Blanchot. The third voice is the indirect one, thus the lengthiest, that of scientific discourse. So this is like the he referred before to the voice of the basically like the voice of the people as a whole, like the voice of the social body is something like what the way he puts it. So the voice of scientific discourse in terms of like the scientific discourse of society. So the indirect one, that one of scientific discourse. On this account, Marx is honored and recognized by other representatives of knowledge. So, in terms of scientific discourse, Marx is honored and recognized by some scientists. He is thus a man of science and responds to all the ethics of the scholar, agrees to submit himself to any and all critical revision. So this makes Marx sounds like a scientist, right? And one of my criticisms of him of Marx is that he's too much of a materialist for me. I'm not an idealist or a dualist. Like I don't really think there is a good option on consciousness, and I'm not a compatibilist either. But I think materialism is too simple, and we don't absolutely like this doesn't mean there is anything metaphysical or anything non-physical, but I think it's possible, even though it's unlikely. Anyway, so that's why one of my criticisms of Marx is that he talks about materialism too Marx and uh, too much rather, and uh, historical materialism. Of course, his whole theory. I'm oversimplifying, of course, but he focuses on the material aspects of theory and of history, and he's right about that. But there are other aspects that are much more important sometimes, which I'm sure many Marxists would agree with. But I think that's often not the most important thing to focus on. But anyway, that's a bit of a tangent. So in this part of the quote, Marx sounds like he's basically a scientist, right? Or thinking like a scientist anyway. And he's submitting himself to any and all critical revision. So to continue the quote, still, capital is an essentially subversive work. So Marx is a full-on materialist, and he thinks scientifically and using rationalism in his in his theories of economics, culture, and politics, right? So he continues here, though. Still, capital is an essentially subversive work, not so much because it would lead by means of scientific objectivity to the necessary consequence of revolution. So again, look, he's not saying here what you think he's saying at first. Blanchot is not saying that Marx claims that revolution that it's scientifically objectively true that a political revolution is required to over for the proletariat to overthrow the bourgeoisie, but he's actually not taking that tack because but even though he's making it sound that way in Capital, which is of course his more famous book, 3 volumes, and that lays out his economic theories in a lot more detail, more specifically than his political theories, but some of his political theories too, with Engel, of course. So it's a much more important work if you're talking about Marx's ideas anyway. So anyway, it makes him sound like a scientist in this section, but it's actually subversive. So it's actually not what Marx is arguing. So capitalism is essentially subversive work, not so much because it would lead by means of scientific objectivity to the necessary consequence of revolution. Rather, it is because it includes, without formulating it too much, a mode of theoretical thinking that overturns the very idea of science. So you see what he's doing here. He's basically using the rational, scientific, objective method to say to scientifically criticize science, and he's using like scientific thinking, or he's using science to debunk science, but he's not actually saying that it's objectively scientifically true that there should be a political revolution. So Blanchot continues here. Actually, neither science nor thinking emerges from Marx's work intact. So he's not just Marx isn't just Blanchot's saying that Marx isn't just criticizing science; he's criticizing thinking and the way people think about things. And he's saying that we should reconsider the way we think about things, which is interesting because it's often what philosophers do, right? And even though I'm not a Marxist, I think he makes some valid points, and trying to make people think differently is what good philosophers tend to do. So I like that aspect of his thinking. So anyway, actually, neither science nor thinking emerges from Marx's work intact. So Blanchot continues. This must be taken in the strongest sense, inasmuch as science is designated there as radical transformation of itself, as theory of a mutation always in play within practice, just as in this practice the mutation is always theoretical. So um, I don't want to like you could use the word evolution perhaps, but let's say mutation. So we can say that a mutation of science can lead to a radical transformation of itself, and not that we should overthrow science, but I think Blanchot's claiming that Marx is saying that the science should mutate in order to radically transform itself to change the theory, or to change the practice of politics, let's say, in terms of Marx. But as he says, the mutation is always theoretical. So anything can be good in theory, but we have to think about how it would be in practice. And obviously, one of the main criticisms of Marx is that his ideas are all well and good in theory, but in practice they aren't going to work out. And then you point to communist revolutions and communist authoritarian states like Stalin's state and Maoism and all of these innumerable communist like dystopias. So anyway though, Marx does understand that it's important to understand how his theories would work in practice. So to basically explain what Blanchot is explaining Marx's points, is this, I would say. So Marx is saying that Marx is putting forth the argument in Capital, but perhaps not as deliberately, not as clearly as he could, because he's trying to be subversive. He's saying that we should use scientific thinking in order to radically transform science, for us to use objective scientific thinking with our new theory in order to radically transform science, so we can lead to a practical political revolution that will and that will end up benefiting society. So Marx wants to use rational objective science in order to radically transform science, to lead to not a political revolution, but a reorganization of politics based on the newly rethought scientific method to improve our lives. So we should use rational scientific thinking in order to radically transform science, which can lead to theoretical political change and practical political revolution that will lead to lasting positive results for all people, or at least people who practice this political theory.